All right, you guys, welcome to European History, Quarter 3. We're going to get started today with this lecture by talking a little bit about Congress of Vienna, the end of Napoleonic age, and the impact that that had on Europe. So first of all, Metternich is a very important character in the post-Napoleonic European world. He was from Austria-Hungary, the Austrian Empire, and he talked about the fact that what happened with the Congress of Vienna and the resolutions that occurred there actually seeded or essentially made the soil fertile for more revolutions. So while he was happy to get a lot of his conservative ideas pushed through, he saw the writing on the wall that this might not be a good thing long term and that people were going to be unhappy. So that's what it means by a revolutionary seed. And you can kind of see the barricades here. And all throughout Europe in the 1800s, you're going to see revolutions within countries in an attempt to get changes made to the political setup. So just a reminder of what the Congress of Vienna was. It occurred in 1815. It lasted for about a year, and it was a discussion and a group that got together leaders of European countries, including France, Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia. That was our quadruple alliance, who had fought, France, Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And France was the loser in the war, so they were there kind of more as observers. But the quadruple alliance would have included Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria. So, and they had representatives from France. You had little retaliation. There wasn't an attempt to punish France as much as to balance power, and that meant that France still had to have some power in order to balance it out between Austria and Russia. They needed to have adversaries that were big enough that it kind of kept the others in their border and kept them from expanding. So they didn't want to strengthen France's enemies too much but they didn't want to weaken France too much. So there was an attempt to create political entities that were about the same size or had about the same power. So this is a famous political cartoon, and you can see below is Talleyrand, and he is the representative from France, and he is holding an image of Louis XVIII, who he would like to see put on the throne. You have Napoleon here trying to cut off a portion of France with his son, who will be Napoleon III. And then you have some of the other main characters, like you have Austria. This is the Metternich, and he's got the scales and he's trying to balance power. And then you have all these other people like Russia and stuff, and they're trying to pull off portions for themselves. So it definitely was a diplomatic negotiating nightmare. But they attempted to create something that kept relative peace between the countries for at least a half a century. Peace within the countries, so that's a whole different issue. So Europe in 1815, on the left-hand side, you see the extent of Napoleon's control. You see the French Empire and how purple it is, and then you see the Allied states, and you can see where France attempted to invade Russia and then the Great Retreat. So this is what Europe was looking like when Napoleon was in charge, and this is what they created to balance power. So you can see that the German Confederation was created. You have Prussia in it and out of it. They got their right foot in and their right foot out. And then you have Austrian Empire partially in the German Confederation and partly outside of it. You have smaller states here, but with loose alliance. You have France here, and then you have Russia. Again, we do not have a unified Italy yet. You can see the Ottoman Empire over here on the side, and then of course Great Britain. So, but on this main European continent, you've got France balanced with Prussia, Austrian Empire, and Russia, and then this loosely connected German Confederation where Prussia and Austria dominate it. So the main objectives was to undo everything that Napoleon had done. So reduce France back to its old boundaries. Her frontiers were essentially pushed back to the beginning of the French Revolution. 1790, restore all the old monarchies as because they wanted like conservative leadership. They didn't like the liberal ideas. They thought it had created the French Revolution, and they thought that had gotten out of control. So anybody they can find after they depose the people that Napoleon had put on the thrones, a lot of times his relatives in these countries, they would bring back the legitimate heir if they could find them. And there was always this new philosophy that came out, was more of a diplomatic one, which they figured that maybe war was not as beneficial as it had been in the past. War in the past had been a way to increase your borders, increase your wealth. And now they're seeing the negatives of war, and they're attempting to balance power and try to use more of like free trade and some other agreements that will allow for you to strengthen your country without actual conflict. So the key players at the Congress of Vienna are Tsar Alexander I of Russia, King Frederick of Prussia, Prince Clemens von Metternich, who is from Austria, Castlereagh, who is from Great Britain, and then Talleyrand, who is the foreign minister from France, representing France in absence of Napoleon, who is on an island in the Atlantic. Again, most important things to come out of this: key established principles, balance of power, that you have a legitimate person on the throne that has a claim to that throne, not because they had a coup d'etat and took it over, but because they essentially were heirs to the throne. So they go back to this idea of like not quite an absolute monarch. They're not going back quite that far, but they definitely think that the family name needs to be there to add legitimacy, so that hopefully you won't have revolutions within the country trying to depose somebody who they think is not a legitimate person to be in charge of their country. So they definitely went back to name recognition. And then compensation. France didn't get punished per se in that they lost territory, but it was like not French really anyway, but they had to pay. So they had to pay an indemnity of whatever that is, 700 million francs to coalition forces, so to the Quadruple Alliance for 3 to 5 years. And for 3 to 5 years that France was occupied in some areas, which will create animosity and anger because no one likes to be occupied, and they're going to be paying money. So some of the changes made at the Congress of Vienna: territory taken away from Napoleon. Russia is given Poland. They want Poland quite often. Prussia is given half of Saxony. You have the German Confederation created. So Napoleon kind of ended the Holy Roman Empire, and now it's gone for good. Austria is given back territory it had lost, plus more in Germany and Italy, which is going to anger Italians and Germans who think like Austria has overstepped. And the House of Orange was given the Dutch Republic to rule, and the Netherlands, the Austrian Netherlands. Additionally, Norway and Sweden are joined together, one country. Switzerland is guaranteed its neutrality. Hanover, which is a portion in like the Germanic area, the German states, is made bigger. You've got Britain given Cape Colony, South Africa, various other colonies in Africa and Asia, as France would lose some of them. Sardinia was given to Piedmont. This is in the like northern Italian area. Nice, Savoy, and Genoa. And then the Bourbon Ferdinand I was restored to the throne in the Two Sicilies. So again, Italy's still pretty broken up. Slave trade is condemned at the urging of the British, but is not officially outlawed. And freedom of navigation was guaranteed for many of the rivers within Europe. So out of this, you see that the Congress of Vienna reflects conservative ideals. And so I wanted to make sure you have to know these really well. What are conservative ideals? The idea that they like Europe before 1789, that they do not like the ideas of the French Revolution, and you could also associate the American Revolution. They did not like those ideas of Republican forms of government. They want royal families. They want hierarchy. They want either the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church to have power in countries, and they like the hierarchy of the church. And just some basic examples of conservatism that you're going to see this week: the Carlsbad Decrees, which were put together by Metternich, which like essentially take away freedom of the press and freedom of education to pursue like new ideas. They kind of limited and censored college professors and stuff like that. That's the Carlsbad Decrees. Those occurred in the Austrian Empire. And then Peterloo Massacre, which occurred in England. And then the 6 acts that came out of the Peterloo Massacre, which you'll also see in 1819, which kind of reinforced conservative principles and made it so that liberal ideas were hard to publish and get across. Now, liberalism is different. Liberalism is what came out of the French Revolution, but it is not modern day liberals. So we need to make sure that we understand this is called classical liberalism. And there's some main things that they wanted. All right, you guys, let's go back to what the classical liberals wanted. First of all, let's define who classical liberals had a tendency to be, which would be the middle class. These are industrialists. These are people who made their money off of the Industrial Revolution. They are in conflict with conservatives, which had a tendency to be people who had titles, who would have been what we'd call landed gentry, who made their money from the land and owning lots of land. So it would have been like the old school people, the people who used to have large estates, and then they'd have essentially peasants who would work their estates. They have lost power, and by the 1800s, the industrialists are in charge. The industrialists are the ones who have money. So there's this conflict between old money and new money. And liberals had a tendency to be new money, and they wanted some major changes to the governmental political system and the economic system. So some of the main things that they wanted changes to is they wanted to make sure that there was a written constitution. They wanted separation of powers. They wanted to have no divine right monarchy. They wanted a republican form of government. They wanted to protect basic rights like freedom of speech and freedom of press. They wanted male property owners to have the right to vote, and they wanted a laissez-faire free trade economic system. So these are the 7 things that the liberals wanted. And you really need to know the difference between conservatives and liberals. All right, now let's go through some of the other philosophies, some of which are competing with liberalism and conservatism, and some of them can work alongside of liberalism and conservatism. So first of all, nationalism or a nationalist is this idea works with conservatives and with liberals. And so what you'll find is a lot of times people use nationalism to promote whichever idea they want. Nationalism is not necessarily connected to being specifically a liberal or a conservative. So let's talk a little bit about what nationalism is. Nationalism is a belief that each person during this time period had their own genius, and that people who have a similar cultural, economic, political, religious, and a lot of times, more importantly than ever, ethnic and language background should have their own country. And so Herder, who was a German, was very well known for supporting this idea. Again, Germany didn't exist yet, but the idea of bringing all Germanic people together who speak a common language was one of his big goals of life. And so you're going to see a real rise in nationalism during this time period, which is going to impact that balance of power that they were attempting to create through some of these empires that didn't necessarily correspond to ethnic and language lines. And so you put people together in countries and areas that they really didn't like. And so that's where you're going to see a lot of these internal conflicts within for countries. So a lot of times countries weren't fighting each other in the first half of the 19th century, but they were having internal conflicts and trying to figure out how to deal with those, because you had this diverse population in places like the Ottoman Empire and the German Confederation, and not all of them wanted to be together. So one of the reasons nationalism occurred was because you started to see the Industrial Revolution leading to people increasingly coming into contact with each other more and more. And some of that was a very positive experience. You know, people started to go and travel much farther from their homes than they ever had before. And with increased trade, created an increased need to communicate. And so a lot of times, maybe local, more distinct dialects were losing out to languages that would allow for communication. So French had become a very popular trade language. English is very popular. You would have German become a popular language, but some of the smaller languages might feel like they're losing out. And so they were starting to feel increasingly pushed. And the result of that is to like fight back and to say, oh, my country is being invaded by all these people from different places and I don't like it. So you also saw a need for family and society to come together as the modern world was moving so quickly and people felt like they had been thrown into a world that they didn't understand. You have so much trade, communication increasing, and people are feeling overwhelmed. And so they become like they look in and they start to desire a society that they understand and looks familiar to them, and they all speak the same language. And so you do start to get this us versus them mentality in the 19th century. Congress of Vienna, like I said, had put different nationalities together. Ethnic groups, wanted their own state. And this is going to lead to revolutionary movements. If liberals can capitalize on this nationalistic fervor, then they might be able to use it to accomplish their liberal goals. If conservatives can say, hey, these liberals' ideas are from another place and can try to push out these nationalistic ideas, then you're going to see conservatives also try to use it. So nationalism can be used by either and was used by either. Socialism, though, is something that's very different. And socialism has this belief that your economic state in life is the most important, not your nationality, not your language, not your ethnicity. And if you are a worker, then you should be working hard, not at a revolution to help the liberals or the conservatives or the people in power, but a revolution to help all workers. And that's where you get this idea of like communism with workers of the world unite. So with socialism, nationalism really doesn't work. And so for the most part, a socialist would be accused of not liking their country very much because it doesn't really mix as much because their biggest concern is inequality economically. So one of the reasons socialism developed was the Industrial Revolution had created this idea of the fact that profit as motive was good, and that if you were selfish and were trying to get the best for you, that somehow would benefit, like that's what Adam Smith said, that would benefit others. And so people started to question this selfish individualism, and they desired a new society that focused on community. And there was a lot of groups that planned to actually create their own little utopian society. So they wanted a plan for the economy to help the poor. They wanted private property to either be regulated, which would be like the less extreme, people, or to abolish altogether, which would have been more revolutionary. And there were different types of socialists. There were democratic socialists and there were revolutionary socialists. So they also proposed that some property or all, depending on how extreme they went, should be owned by the community or the state. So these are some of the main socialist principles. As we continue on, we're going to move now. So we've got liberalism, we've got conservatism, and we've got socialism. And then we have nationalism, which can be sprinkled with conservatism and liberalism, but doesn't really fit well with socialism. Now we're going to talk a little bit about liberal economics, because conservative economics is the way that it was that we were talking about before we went on break, which is with mercantilism and the idea that a government will try to protect its industries by creating tariffs, and which essentially taxes on trade, and also restricting trade between the mother country and her colonies, which benefits the mother country, but a lot of times doesn't necessarily benefit all the people in that country, because a lot of times they might have to pay a higher cost for a certain product because the colonies that this country like France has doesn't produce them as cheaply as the colonies that Britain has. So would it be better to buy it from a British colony? Yes, but everyone was protecting their trade relationships. Liberals want laissez-faire, which means let it be, or hands off. They want free trade. And so you're going to see liberal economists during this time period pushing to get rid of tariffs and trade restrictions in order to create this free trade idea. They also want the government to keep its hands off any kind of business affairs. And that has some positives for some people. It could possibly lower the price of things, but for workers, it may also harm them because there's a lot of safety. regulations. So there's going to be this argument over, should we increase safety? Should we put restrictions on the economy? Think of like minimum wage laws and stuff like that. So the most famous, which we think we've already mentioned this year, I think we talked about this before we went on break, pretty sure, is Thomas Mathis, who did the essay on the principle of population and said you can't really do anything about the fact that population is just going to rise. And so you pretty much keep your hands off. And if you do that, eventually people will die because they're not healthy, the wages aren't high enough for them, and then there will be fewer people and then wages will rise. So just this idea that population increases exponentially and food never keeps up with that, it increases arithmetically. So as a result, you're always going to have this situation where there's going to be this balance, and the government should just keep its hands off and it will do it naturally. That's that big liberal idea. David Ricardo, same thing, saw this vicious cycle with wages. And he again said, government just needs to keep its hands off. People will have fewer children if wages are low, and the result will be that wages will slowly rise. Again, government, stay uninvolved. That's the big thing. And then Jeremy Bentham is also considered a liberal economist, and he believes in this idea of utilitarianism and this idea that you create the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. So again, you're going to leave out a lot of minorities and people who are in a smaller group who maybe can't worry about everyone, right? That's what he would say. And so he wanted to make poverty as least desirable as possible, which I think is funny because poverty is always not very desirable. But he wanted to make poverty really bad so people would want to stay away from it. And so the only government help that he would give was when you were in like that destitute kind of state, which would be that he would allow for workhouses. But some people called them the New Bastille. You know, the Bastille was like the political prison, but because essentially these poor laws that created workhouses were really meant to reform people. And so as a result, it separated families. Women and men went to separate ones. Children were put into the workhouses with their families because they were poor. So essentially punished people for being poor. Didn't really work. The other thing, though, that was really important to these people was getting rid of something called the Corn Laws. And we're going to learn more about them, but they were taxes, tariffs, essentially, on grain coming into Britain. The goal was to make British grain. So for people who own land in Britain, they're trying to produce grain. Well, there's grain coming from the American colonies during this time period in the 1800s. And because of better weather, better land, more growing seasons, the grain coming from the colonies, former colonies, because America was a country by then, the grain coming from the United States was cheaper. So in order to keep the British farmers in business, they put a tariff on the grain coming from the United States, made it more expensive. And the result was, who pays more? The British people for food. It helped to lead, I don't know if helped is the right word, to the Irish potato famine, where a whole bunch of people died in Ireland because their potato got a blight in the 1840s. And they couldn't afford grain from overseas because the Corn Laws were in place. And so it just became this lightning rod of an issue in England about, who do we really care about? The people and them getting food? Or do we care about these old, rich nobility and their land and how they're not making enough money off of it? And so eventually the Corn Laws will get overturned, but it takes a long time. Okay, so we're going to try to finish up here pretty quickly. Utopian socialists, you'll read about them in your book. Again, socialists, but their goal was to try to create these societies and not just read about them. And in order to do that, they had to create them on a small scale because obviously the governments were not going to sign on to a lot of the socialist ideas. So utopian socialists advocated creation of ideal communities, and they questioned capitalism as an economic system. So obviously they would go directly against the liberal economists and the liberals in general. Robert Owen is one of the most well-known of these, that he was not against the Industrial Revolution, which some socialists were. Some socialists wanted to go back to like farming. But he said that it had to be a different factory system. So he envisioned communities where people, factory and farm workers, lived together and they shared their resources. He specifically came to the United States and created New Harmony in Indiana, but it failed because people fight. He also created currency based on work time, amount of labor. You can see it down here, 1 hour of labor, you get a little bill, versus necessarily like what you produced, because he thought everybody worked, so they should get paid the same. Charles Fourier, he advocated the construction of phalanxes. They were agrarian communities where people did different tasks every day, so they didn't get bored. And so there's not that repetitiveness of the Industrial Revolution. Again, all of these things failed, but you'll read more about them later. Last thing before I have to go to a meeting really quickly. So anarchists are the ones who wanted to get rid of government because they believed it constrained people's natural rights. And so you have certain people who reject industry and government completely. Auguste Blanc, some call it Blanqui, called for violent overthrow of capitalism. So anarchists sometimes just wanted to peacefully do things, like Proudhon peacefully advocated like the idea that businesses and people could mutually work together with exchange of goods and services. Or you have the violent revolutionary anarchists like Blanquet, who wanted to just kill people. But again, anarchism is like, in the big scale of things, you have lots of socialists. You have lots of people going towards communism. You have a lot of people who are liberals and many people who are conservatives. This is a small segment of people. Smaller than even what I would say would be the utopian socialists who are actually moving to communities. Most of these people were philosophically thinking people, meaning that they didn't often actually try to play out what they believed. They wrote about it. So every once in a while, you'll have an anarchist who assassinates someone or something. But for the most part, anarchism is kind of on the margins of society. But it was something that came out of the Industrial Revolution time period and the post-French Revolution and some of the changes that had been made and how people reacted and were upset. So a lot of people during this time period, I really like it because you've got all these isms, but this time period is about questioning and change. So those Enlightenment ideas and all those natural rights that the liberals talked about didn't actually get for many people what they wanted. You have poverty for tons of people. You have economic inequality. And so you have a lot of people who are thinking, yeah, we didn't like conservatism, that didn't serve us, but liberalism is not working for us either. So they started to look for alternative systems, not just of government, but of economic systems. And the result is instability. And so we're not going to go into these right now. I'll have a separate lecture for you on the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. But Congress of Vienna set up this conservative system. People are fighting against it. For the most part, Europeans aren't fighting each other, meaning between countries. They're fighting within their own country for an economic and political system that reflects their ideals. And so that's where we are in the mid-1800s.